Hello and welcome back to Breaking Ground on iPropertyRadio with myself, Carol Tallon. You can contact us on social media at iPropertyRadio or email hello@iPropertyRadio.com. This week, I'm chatting to Tony Reddy, Chairman of Reddy Architecture and Urbanism. Tony, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Carol. It's very
Tony,
good to be here.
Thank you. Well, Tony, really one of the things I want to talk to you about today, your name is synonymous with the delivery of some really great projects in Ireland and beyond. But today I wanted to talk to you about our planning system, because I have been criticised in the past on air for saying that our planning system is dysfunctional or no longer fit for purpose. And surprise, surprise, I read, a couple of editorials that you wrote in recent months, but one particularly where you actually use the phrase the Irish planning system is no longer functioning effectively to meet the needs of our society. And quite frankly, it's only slowed down since then. So you might just give our audience an overview as to planning in Ireland and where we find ourselves now in 2023.
Okay, well, as I said in my article, I think there are serious problems with both the Irish and British planning systems. They're both out of the same stable. The 1947 British Planning Act and the 1963 Irish Planning Act are very similar in structure. And the added problem with the Irish system is that we also have a right of third-party appeal. While that may have functioned to a degree when Ireland was relatively a rural society with not a significant amount of development, the situation has really changed in the last 10, 15 years, where we've become an urban society. Development is significant and complex. And the challenges our society faces with significant growth in population, one of the youngest populations in Europe, by the way, with a huge emerging need for new housing to provide for that, and indeed with all the related services, schools, third level institutions, workplace, all of those things put a huge demand on our society, and our planning system is frankly creaking. I was putting the proposition that when we look at our European colleagues, they, unlike Britain and Ireland, they have a quite different planning system. And another role that I fulfill is I'm a director, former chair of the Academy of Urbanism. That's a London-based knowledge organization. And we look all over the world at great places and what makes them tick. And we try to gather that information to teach people who are involved in making of cities, making of places, that they can learn from that.
Tony, just in terms of the urbanism and around placemaking, in your experience, how much changes? Because we talk a lot about, I suppose, the psychology. The reality is planning is a public function. And previously, maybe the public wasn't as engaged in our planning process. And there's a lot to argue there that it's not designed to be inviting for the public. And actually what's happened now is that all engagement, or sorry, the majority of engagement appears to be negative. So we don't get much positive engagement. So will you maybe take us to some of the fundamentals of placemaking? Because, you know, you have some international exposure there. So you talk about what makes a place great. What does make a place great?
Well, I think what makes a place great is that the vision of the particular city or society is a unified vision. And there are good methods, effective methods of governance that ensure it's delivered. We see that a lot more in continental Europe. And coming back to the specific point you made about engagement, I personally, in the articles I wrote for the Business Post, I believe we should embrace communication. I think what's different with British and Irish society is that our Planning Act, firstly, it's non-specific The words used in both acts are that a development plan, it consists of words and maps. Quite frankly, that's the sort of language of another era. If you look at the development plan of Copenhagen or Stockholm or Amsterdam or Berlin or Hamburg, these development plans are visionary, firstly. They're in 3 dimensions, both in model form and in CGIs. And there's huge communication. Our problem is that because we've a vague written plan with colored maps, it's left to the third party to decide on the form. Our planning system, our planners don't plan. Very few of them plan. Most of them process planning applications. When I go to the planning department in Copenhagen or in Stockholm or Helsinki or Berlin, I go to, or recently I was in Freiburg. In Freiburg, and it just happens I remember the figures, they had 35 planners planning a relatively small city about the size of Cork. They had 3 people processing planning applications because the vision was an agreed vision. There's models, there's 3-dimensional studies. So the height, the mass, in some cities, even the materials are specified, but there's a clear vision of what the society wants. That's been debated. In a recent visit last year, I was in Aarhus, in the second city of Denmark. And what the local authority there explained to us was they've 13 political parties, from the extreme left, the revolutionary Marxist party, to the extreme right, a real fascist party. But what was amazing was, and then in many centrist parties, the amazing thing was, for those 13 parties, the vision of their city was the same physical vision. While they might disagree about the content, the revolutionary Marxists wanted it all to be built by the state, controlled by the state, and in a very odd way, the right-wingers had a similar vision, but a different control. And in the middle, you had the varying forms of governance that you find in others. But the physical vision of the city was a unified one. And that's what I was arguing in the Business Post, that our system should embrace communication. It's too late when a complex planning application, and planning applications when I was a young man are quite different today. It's almost like a Cecil B. DeMille film. There's a cast of thousands, bat experts, lighting experts, watercourse experts, archaeologists. The list becomes more and more, wind experts. It gets very complex. So a planning application, formal planning application, documentation is huge. I took a photograph recently of our staff bringing planning application. They were bringing box loads of material, which is never looked at, out to a truck to be carried to the planning department. What I'm arguing for is that we bring it all back. Sorry, the other side of our system is, because there's an appeal late in the day, people are frustrated, rightly, but it's like shooting fish in a barrel. You set someone, you set a lawyer to find a fault, you're going to find a fault. That's their job. And that's what's been happening. So the system is broken, but we're not really solving any problem. We have a huge housing crisis, and people are generally unhappy. What I'm arguing for is that our city development plan should be visionary, like continental Europe. We should have a debate among everybody with the NIMBYs or the bananas, build anything, build absolutely nothing anywhere, etc. We need to have a debate with these people. The people who don't believe in public transport and are arguing for a city that's car-based, we need to show them in debate what that means, that we have a city of Dublin of 100-kilometer radius, or Cork at 50-kilometer radius. Do people understand what that physically means? And I believe
but Tony, sorry to interrupt you there, but Tony, is debate the right word here? Because you've said it yourself, you've questioned it there. Do people understand? I would argue that they don't. And the reason for that is that we're not, you've said there on a number of times there that communication, the importance of communication. And I think that we do communications from developer, from projects, whether it's private developers or state developers, to the community. I think we do that exceptionally badly. And I think both the public and private sector do that exceptionally badly. And on both sides, there's a mistrust. We know that either the private sector delivery project owners or the public sector, they don't trust the community to open real communication. So there's quite tokenistic, tick the box, compliance-led consultation, but it's not true participation. And, I'm not sure if I agree with you that a conversation needs to happen at an earlier stage, but I don't think it would even be a debate. I think it's an education piece that needs to happen, but we need to communicate with people in a way they understand. And most people don't understand plans and maps.
But I suppose that's precisely what I'm saying. What I'm saying is they should see models, they should see GIs, the communication in most of our European fellow EU countries is far better than ours. In fact, the image behind you of the docklands, ironically, that is the result of the sort of system I'm talking about. Now, I don't think there was enough communication with it, but that was based on a vision. There were lots of debates. I debated about certain heights and things at the time, but I do accept the vision. And that vision has delivered a significant piece of city for us that has exemplary public spaces, has opened up a huge part of the city that didn't exist in my childhood. It has improved the attractiveness of our city to inward investment. Had Dublin City Council, using its traditional planning mechanisms, been in charge of this area, we'd be probably still dealing with the early additional information requests on the first planning applications. I suppose what I'm arguing for is that I'd also like to say that we in Ireland have a history of planning like this. Dublin itself first began to significantly change when the Duke of Ormond came back from a 10-year period of exile with King Charles in France and the other courts of Europe. And he came back no longer kind of your typical Anglo-Irish aristocrat who was not really interested in cities or city planning. He came back with a vision for a city. And unlike King Charles, who had to deal with the prospect that he didn't want to be beheaded, he had to move very carefully. Sir Christopher Wren and others did great plans for London after the Great Fire and after the plague. But ultimately, he went for a rebuilding of the original city because he was afraid to move. There was no such restriction on the Duke of Ormond. He came back to Dublin. The first thing he did was he determined that, and it's the first city in these islands that has a roadway onto the river. He told Sir Humphrey Jervis, one of the burghers of the city, that he wasn't going to build his house backing onto the river like others, that he wanted him to turn it around and face the river. So that's now on Ormond Quay. He went on to plan the Phoenix Park, the Royal Hospital, St. Stephen's Green, Smithfield. In a relatively short lifetime, he did all that, even in his native Kilkenny, or it's not his native, but the home of his family seat in Kilkenny. He laid out the parade.
But I would imagine that today's planners would say that they're dealing with a very different environment. They're dealing with a highly critical public. They're dealing with a hugely political planning process.
The reason they're dealing with that is in the absence of a vision. I wanted to go on and say we then had a whole series of visionaries who contributed to Georgian Dublin. There was a sense of pride from a unified grouping, very similar, as I said, to the European politicians. I believe our politicians are capable of that unity of purpose as well. Going on beyond that, the White Streets commissioners continue that on to the middle of the 19th century. And as I say, in the 20th century, the Dublin Docklands Development Authority made big changes to our city. I suppose what I'm basically saying is our planning system should be one that puts forward the vision, debates alternative visions. And that was where I was talking about the debate, but the debate is based on physical evidence, pictures, models, not on colored maps and text, which, quite frankly, I speak for every architect and person and planner probably. No one reads the development plan except lawyers afterwards. I might read specific pages that I need to know about an application, but I don't look to it for how I feel that the future of my city is going to be. It's ironic, I can go online and look at Copenhagen or Berlin or Hamburg or Stockholm or Helsinki or Oslo or any of these cities today and see a short but clear vision of what's planned in the next 5 to 10 years. That's the future I'd like to see for our cities.
You know, the process you're describing there is one that I feel in the last decade has been the approach of area master plan. So it certainly seems to be the approach that is recognized as what works. But in terms of the development plan, where are we falling down and seeing where we are today? What's the jumping off point? How do we start to make the change?
The immediate practical way to deal with the current problem, and you've correctly identified, local area plans and sort are often whole development plans exist with named local area plans to be done that never get done, or they get done a year or two before the end of the development plan, so they're out of date. We need to change our legislation. One, I believe that the local area plan should be done concurrently with the development plan. Given that we've just passed a whole lot of development plans, my suggestion would be that within 1 year, the government should legislate that the local area plans for all of the areas nominated should be prepared. And if the planners require assistance, they should hire external help. My real aim, though, long term, is it would be better that this was done in-house by the planners. But as I said, if we reallocate people to planning and spend less, the planning application process should become simpler, as it is in Europe. Like essentially, it doesn't preclude someone doing something special that doesn't follow the plan, but the majority of applications would be a tick box. They show they comply. Our Australian and New Zealander colleagues brought in a rule about 7 years ago aimed at densifying their suburbs. And they brought in an incredibly simple rule. And they said that if you have 2 houses or more together on a site, and they're more than 4 feet off the boundary, in other words, they don't touch the boundary, they could automatically write their own permission to reach the new, to reach the new density standards. So a site with 2 houses might be replaced by 10 houses. That permission issues in 44 days. Okay. Because it's simple, because an administrator can deal with it, because it's either true or it's not true. You either comply or you don't, and the application consists of showing you comply. Our problem is there is no vision, there is no aspiration as to where we're heading with most of our development plans. Therefore, it becomes a complex process.
Tony, how do we go about setting that right? Because, you know, I very recently carried out an interview with Mitchell McDermott's Paul Mitchell, and yes, you know, it's interesting, in a completely different context, he actually put forward that really we should be declaring a state of emergency in terms of our housing for the next 2 years, and that means emergency style measures. But one of the emergency style measures he called for was a large number of planners, possibly currently in the private sector, to be seconded for state planning. So it's interesting that, you know, and it's not just a resource issue. we need to be bringing the vision as well. So a lot of the chokeholds in our delivery is coming back to planning. And I suppose one of the questions I have is, even if we were to get those people, and so we had the resources and we scaled up capacity, how would we get to the unified or agreed vision? Because to my mind, we're so far away from that at the moment, and we see that through the battles that are happening at a community level. How do we move towards achieving a vision that is unified or agreed?
Well, I think Paul, from what you've described, and I know Paul well, I think he was describing a way of dealing with the current backlog.
Oh no, and that's absolutely it. But it occurs to me that it could actually feed into what you're calling for now.
Yeah, well, let me put it this way. I think the backlog has to be dealt with, but it exists in the old form. What I'm suggesting for immediately is we bring in external help to work with the planning departments to begin to do those local area plans in 3 dimensions with CGIs and models, and that is made mandatory. It's no longer to be done in the old form, and because a lot of LAPs are still done by map and description, and that's simply not good enough. In fact, one of the concerns I would have is the planning profession as it has developed in Britain and Ireland. In my opinion, many planners do not plan at all. They process information. And I'm arguing for planners planning and having a vision and creating the framework in which society can buy into and agree with that vision, and that hearts and minds are one. You're not going to win hearts and minds with the sort of development plan that we're churning out at present in our local authorities.
Tony, do you believe, based on where we are now, do you believe that there's an appetite for change?
I have to say I do. I mean, I this idea, and when before I wrote the article for the Business Post, I spoke to a number of colleagues and people I know from across the spectrum. And the one thing I was pleased at was, naturally, a lot of developers were happy to simply have certainty, because the uncertainty is causing great angst. From, I think I said in my article, and I certainly thought it, from London to New York to Frankfurt, the word is spreading that the Irish planning system is a basket case, and it's not a place where they want to invest. That has serious implications for our country. Mm-hmm. But the other area that the people who are concerned about development were interested in the idea because they got certainty from this process. And I think one of the things I did in that article was I showed photographs, which I'd taken myself, of various models, city models, and in the background were CGIs, and people instantly got it. In fact, the photographs I showed were of Gothenburg. I also had Stockholm, but Gothenburg was the one that struck the chord. It's about the same size as Cork, but they have a whole huge suite, city suite, that a visitor or a citizen can go to. You can have a coffee, you can look at the model of the city, you can look at CGIs, you can look at the area of the city you're interested in and see the vision for that part of the city. That's the way, that's positive planning process. And that's what I would like for our country. Okay.
Knowing, I suppose, looking at what we can control and what's outside of our control, you're working on some really landmark, your company, your team, they're working on some really landmark projects. So how, to what extent can the private sector maybe take a lead in this? Even down to simple things like you're talking about communications being the key. Like, one of the things we've been proposing and really trying to promote over the last number of years is the use of immersive technologies. And obviously it would be better if planners would accept those as part of the planning application as well. Obviously there's a whole movement that needs to happen towards digital planning, and we know that that's underway, and it is in process. But where do you think can the private sector maybe show some leadership in this?
Well, I think a lot of more progressive developers are doing that. The quality of the documentation they're producing is much better. But I think the problem, both for the developers and for society, is that it's too late in the process. That I think that the debate about the future of our cities needs to be as the development plan is being produced and at the beginning. And the appeal system should be at the beginning of the system. So in other words, it might be that the local authority's vision, if someone wants to appeal, if somebody believes we should have a car-based society, for example, and they truly believe that, let that be debated through the appeals process. But once it's over, and that was the way it was in Dublin, once that's been passed, it's almost treated like an outline permission, that if you comply with the height, the mass, the density, all of the other technical requirements, that there's an automatic permission. The debate about the future is at the beginning with the council. And as I say, what that leads to in most European countries is an amazing cross-party acceptance that that's the vision of their city. I mean, I'm quite amazed at the number of countries I've gone to see that happening, having fought tooth and nail with each other to arrive at it. But they arrive at it through looking at models, through looking at images produced by professional planners, and the term is often used, architect, urban designers, or urbanists. We don't have those here in significant numbers. In fact, minuscule numbers, we only have them. Most of our planners simply tick boxes. They don't.
Tony, in reality, how much or to what extent is this impacting Ireland's reputation abroad?
Oh, well, firstly, I think the more important thing is, I think it's hugely causing a generational division. I know in my own family, I have 3 daughters and 1 son, and we have this regular debate about the generation before and the society that we've left to the present day. And they're right. It is not a functioning society. The failure on how to deal with the housing crisis is a serious problem. But in terms of international reputation, it's much more serious. I mean, the engine for the change in our society, which probably about 10 years after us joining the EU, Ireland began to benefit from being in the EU, and we gradually took off. That investment in the country has been very important to achieving that independence, and it has allowed our population to grow and for young people to be employed here. So it has hugely affected our international reputation, and it is something has to be dealt with as a matter of priority. Very
Tony, in recent weeks, over the Christmas break, I came across an old video from 1965 around foreign direct investment on the west coast of Ireland, from an energy plant in Cove right up to the fisheries in Donegal, and all the counties in between, you know, Clare, Limerick, Mayo, and people were interviewed at the time. There was
very interested in seeing it, by the way.
Oh, it's great. Do you know, I did share it, but I'll send it on to you after the interview. But it's really interesting, and there was such a sense of enthusiasm. There was such a welcome for foreign direct investment into Ireland, and particularly around the Shannon region. It was because I suppose it's an area where they could really see what the benefits could be, and I think that conversation has somehow shifted in the last 5, 6, 7 years, that foreign direct investment is somehow insidious. Really, there seems to be a lack of joined up thinking about how real estate development is financed. You know, so we're talking about a rental crisis, and at the same people who are complaining about the rental crisis are not welcoming of foreign investment coming into Ireland. So, like, how do we reconcile that?
Well, I think the answer I would give to that is that I think any of us who are involved in the industry, or whether they're architects or planners or builders or developers or those involved in the provision of housing, we all recognize it isn't build to rent versus build to sell. It isn't social housing or affordable housing versus. We actually need all types of housing. And our problem has been, over the last 10 years or more, well, after the crash, we had nothing for 4 or 5 years. Other than foreign direct investment, we do not have the pillar banks investing at all in development. So that has dried up the source of funding in the private sector. So the only source of private funding is international investment. On the other side of the coin, the state has been very slow to get its act together and to build in the way it has a history of achieving it from the 20s and 30s onwards and the 50s, when we had very little in terms of financial availability. We managed to do it. There are some serious institutional and operational problems here, but my answer is simply we need to persuade people we need all these things. Foreign direct investment is just one of many things we need. We need our pillar banks to actually pony up and do something. We probably need a state bank to help with it, and we need the state and local authorities and the LDA all to be providing housing. Because the other side of this coin, and it's probably a subject for another discussion, that I'm involved also in Property Industry Ireland, and our economists make it very clear that we've been making it clear that the projections on the population were wrong. Our projections were within 10,000 of the ultimate outcome of the census. The Department of Housing and the planning authorities were insisting their figures were out by 360,000. But they wouldn't listen to advice.
Now, I know in recent months, I think Property Industry Ireland has done a great job in putting that forward. And I know that the Minister for Housing has, in the last month or 6 weeks, agreed to review. Now,
and that's welcome. But it's like, we know the answers. It's taking too long. That response time should be much more immediate.
Tony, notwithstanding what you've said about the need for a vision, you know, I suppose, first of all, let's ask you as an urbanist, you know, where should Dublin be? Where should Dublin be aiming towards? What should Dublin look like in the next 50 years?
I would say in the next 25 years on to 50 years, we should be looking at a more sustainable city that has a much higher proportion of public transport. It should be a greener city. It should be a green blue city. In other words, it should link to its green ecology, but also to its water, river ecology and sea. I think it should be a city where housing is available, as it is in somewhere like Helsinki. They've solved the housing crisis. So I would like to think within 10 years, we've solved our housing crisis, that there are no homeless, that housing is affordable, and that we are a beacon to the rest of the world as to how a modern European civilized equitable society would function.
Look, that sounds like a clear and compelling vision, one that I think the majority of people would be able to get behind, certainly kind of in headline terms. But I suppose before we wrap up today, and I'm conscious of your time and I genuinely appreciate you being so generous with your time, but I suppose action plans, you know, where can we start now? So the state being where it is, our planning system being where it is, our developers and the development community being where they are now and the challenges that they have in 2023, what reasonably would be some action steps to move us in the right direction?
Okay, on the planning front, I'd say two things. One, as my colleague Paul Mitchell had suggested, I think we need to get some outsiders in to quickly process the backlog. But more importantly, I think the minister needs to direct planning authorities to start producing local area plans in 3 dimensions, in models and CGIs, in all of the areas of the cities and towns that are involved. In terms of the housing crisis, I could go on at length because I've written quite a lot about that. But I think some of the key ones are, I would remove VAT and levies from housing, certainly for first-time buyers, if not for more. I mean, uniquely in Europe, we have those things are usually spread across the entire community. I think most adults, when they realize that the effect of their children is it's adding roughly 17.5% to the cost of a home, that's simply a tax on something they have to take a mortgage out for 30 years is simply inequitable. I've written about medium density housing, which exists everywhere in the in Europe, South America, Australia, New Zealand. It's densities of 35 to about 80 to 100 per hectare, which is a very good density. That's done with housing. We're obsessed with rules which, based on rules written in 1918, Lloyd George introduced them in 1919, Homes for Heroes. Very appropriate for their day, completely inappropriate for Ireland or Britain indeed in the 21st century. But unfortunately, there are a lot of people in the system who are wedded to those restrictive regulations. I think those changes would make a big difference to the provision of housing.
Tony,
in the relatively immediate future.
Very good. And before we finish up, how optimistic are you that the government, the party of the day or the parties of the day will be able to start to tackle this in the next 12 months?
Well, I'd actually say that this, and again, I spoke about the European example. I actually think that this almost all of the parties in the Dáil, except Sinn Féin, have been in government over the last 10 in the housing department. I think Sinn Féin will have the same problems as the existing parties, while it may try to do things better in certain areas. The reality is that there is a bureaucracy within our Department of Housing that is part of the problem. In fact, there's a double problem: the silo effect of between various government departments. I mean, the Department of Finance deals with some of the issues I spoke about, VAT and levies. The Department of Housing is not allowed to deal with those issues other than implementing them. The actual ministers and their departments need to work more closely to remove the impediments that exist, which are leading and exacerbating the housing crisis.
And finally, this is something that I ask, everybody who has been in the industry for a long time, is this an industry that you would encourage the next generation into? Do you feel that there is, some of the problems feel so entrenched now, it feels that maybe a new wave of thinking might be necessary? Are we attracting the right people into the industry? And is it something that you'd recommend?
Well, I'm fortunate that I've worked outside of Ireland and as well as in Ireland. I've seen many recessions and ups and downs. I think one of the joys of being an architect and an urban designer is that you do go through those troughs, but when it comes up the other side and you begin to overcome problems, there is a great feeling of success. And I'm again looking at, it's a very appropriate image you have behind it, Carol, because I can remember in the mid-80s only, learned papers being written about how difficult it would ever be to get any development to occur in this forbidding landscape, and how wrong they were. So my colleagues call me the ultimate optimist. So yes, I would encourage my children or grandchildren to go into the industry.
Very good, Tony. I think it's good to finish on a bit of optimism to start the year, because the problems, like I said, some of them feel quite entrenched. So a bit of optimism is what we need. But look, I would absolutely echo your call for vision in placemaking, because it's what we know now. It's what we know our communities are demanding. It's not just what they want; it's what they're demanding. Right. So it's a great one. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. I genuinely appreciate it. That was Tony Reddy, Chairman of Reddy Architecture and Urbanism. And that's it from us this week. You can get in touch with the show on social media at iPropertyRadio or email hello@iPropertyRadio.com. My thanks to the Hear Me Roar production team and to Luke Delaney on sound for Dublin South FM. Until next time, thank you for listening.